She spent 10 years searching for answers, until a small pair of cowboy boots and a forgotten tiara revealed the truth that changed her life forever. If you know or have lived a story like this, share it with us in the comments. We want to hear your story of overcoming injustice. She never imagined she would be here sharing this story. It was one of those days she never wanted to come, but one that would end up changing her forever. She was sitting in her car alone, parked by the side of a quiet country road, unsure of her next move. The air was heavy with a sense of uncertainty, and her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel. She had driven for hours, not knowing exactly why, just following a gut feeling, a whisper in her mind that wouldn't let her be. For 10 years she had lived with the unimaginable pain of losing her daughter, Fiona, who had disappeared without a trace. 10 years of wondering, searching and hoping against hope that somehow, some way, Fiona would be found. Each year felt like an eternity, each day a reminder of the empty space where her daughter should have been. She couldn't even begin to describe how it felt, the constant ache in her chest that never went away, the tears that never seemed to stop. But that day, something changed. It wasn't just another ordinary day filled with endless memories of what was lost. No, this day felt different. There was something in the air, something pulling her toward a path she hadn't expected. As she sat there, staring out the window, she could feel the weight of the years pressing down on her. She had always kept hope alive, held on to the belief that Fiona was still out there somewhere. But today she felt a strange, undeniable urge to push beyond the familiar, to follow the faintest of leads, even if it seemed crazy. She knew she had to take a step forward, no matter how terrifying it seemed. For a moment she wondered if she was just imagining things. Was it desperation? Had the years of heartache finally started to affect her sanity? But as she took a deep breath, something inside her whispered that she was right to trust her instincts. This was not just another false hope. This was something different. She turned the key in the ignition, determined to follow whatever path lay ahead. Little did she know that single decision would set in motion a chain of events that would bring her face to face with the truth, a truth she had never dared to believe was possible. The drive felt endless, though it had only been a few miles. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled toward something, toward an answer she had spent a decade seeking. As the miles passed, she found herself thinking back to that day, Fiona's disappearance, the endless search, and the pain of never knowing what truly happened. She remembered the helplessness in her chest as she stood by the cornfield, calling out her daughter's name over and over. But there was no answer, just the rustling of the wind in the tall, swaying stalks. Fiona was gone. For years, she had been trying to live with that, trying to accept it. But the emptiness never left. The feeling that someone somewhere knew something they didn't haunted her. Over the years, she had become familiar with the stares of others, the whispers, the way people would look away when she entered a room. It was as though they all thought she was crazy for still holding on to the belief that Fiona might still be alive. But she knew in her heart that her daughter was out there somewhere. She couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. As she drove, memories of Fiona came rushing back. The sound of her laughter, the way her tiny hand fit perfectly in hers, the way Fiona used to insist on wearing her little cowboy boots everywhere, even to bed. Those boots were gone, but the memories, the love, were still there. They would always be there. She tried to focus on the road ahead, but the tears welled up anyway. After all this time, after so much pain, there was still hope. And it felt real, stronger than ever before. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if Fiona was reaching out to her, urging her to keep searching. That's when the voice inside her head became louder. "It's not over," it said. "You're closer than you think." With that thought, she pushed the pedal to the metal, her heart racing. She didn't know where this road would lead her, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was finally on the right path. As she reached the familiar crossroads near the farm, something inside her shifted. The landscape before her seemed to blur in the background, and all she could focus on was the sense that she was walking, or in this case, driving, on a tightrope. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat more urgent than the last. She had come this far and she couldn't turn back now. The Becca farm was just ahead, and it had always been a place she tried to avoid. The tension between their families went back years, and Maggie couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment whenever she thought about Clay Becker, the man who had always been a thorn in her side. Even now, after everything that had happened, she couldn't shake the bitterness she felt. But that wasn't why she was here today. No, today wasn't about old grudges or family feuds. It was about Fiona. She turned onto the dirt road that led to the farm, her hands steady on the wheel but her mind a whirlwind. The Beccas had never been a welcoming family, and she doubted they'd change their ways, but there was no turning back. As the truck rumbled down the long, winding path, memories of long-forgotten arguments, harsh words, and cold shoulders filled her mind. But those were the past, and the past no longer mattered. What mattered now was finding the truth. Maggie pulled up to the old farmhouse, her eyes scanning the area. The farm looked just like it always had, quiet, almost eerie in its stillness. It was a strange feeling, being here again, knowing that somewhere on this property, buried beneath years of resentment, there was a secret waiting to be uncovered. She didn't know what that secret was, but she felt in her bones that she was closer than ever to discovering it. With a deep breath, she turned off the engine and stepped out of the truck, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her like a thick fog. Today, she would face the truth, and no matter what it was, she was ready. The farm was unusually quiet, and Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had spent enough time on farms to know that silence like this was rare. It was unsettling. As she walked toward the barn, she could see that Clay's truck was parked outside, but there was no sign of him. Maybe he was inside, working. She didn't care. For years, she had tried to ignore the Beccas, tried to convince herself that whatever bad blood existed between their families was irrelevant. But today, that old bitterness felt like a heavy weight around her neck. Maggie wasn't sure if she wanted to confront Clay or just get the answers she needed. She wasn't here to start a fight. She was here because her daughter's disappearance had never made sense, and everything pointed to Clay. She had to be sure. She had to know. As she neared the barn, the smell of hay and animals filled her nose, the familiar scent of a working farm. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the barn door, her pulse quickening. She pushed it open slowly, stepping inside. It was dimly lit, the only sound the shuffle of animals and the soft rustle of straw beneath her boots. But something wasn't right. As she walked further into the barn, her eyes scanned the area. There, in the far corner, she noticed something strange, something that didn't belong in a place like this. A small pink Hello Kitty headband, partially buried in the dirt. Maggie's heart stopped. It was the type of headband Fiona used to wear all the time, back when she was a little girl. She had loved that headband, always wearing it no matter what. As Maggie knelt down, her mind raced. What was this doing here? Clay had no children, at least, none that Maggie knew of. And if that wasn't enough, the sight of it made her feel a cold chill run down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized just how wrong everything felt. Her daughter's headband in a pig barn. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made her stomach turn, but before she could process what she was feeling, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Clay was standing in the doorway, his face hard and angry. His eyes locked onto the headband, and for a moment, the world around Maggie seemed to stop. She had to know what was going on, but something in his expression told her that she was treading on dangerous ground. Clay's eyes never left the headband as he stepped forward, his presence suddenly filling the entire barn. Maggie stood there, frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. It felt as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. She couldn't look away from his face, which had now twisted into an expression that was part anger, part something darker. She tried to steady her breathing, but the reality of what she had just found was starting to set in. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaky but determined. Clay didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another step closer, his jaw tightening with each movement. "What are you doing here?" he finally growled, his tone low and harsh. Maggie's mind raced. She couldn't back down now. She had to know the truth. The headband, Fiona's headband, was in his barn, and she needed to understand why. But her gut told her there was more to it than just an object. There was something deeper, something that Clay was hiding. Her body was on high alert, and every nerve screamed at her to leave, to run as fast as she could, but her feet remained planted firmly on the ground. She couldn't leave. Not now. "I found this," Maggie said, her voice slightly more controlled now, though the tremor was still there. "What is it doing here?" For a moment, Clay stood completely still, his eyes flickering to the headband and then back to her. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he seemed to be weighing his options. Finally, he stepped closer, his posture tense. "Get out," he spat. "Now. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're not welcome here." Maggie could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she refused to step back. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was something far more serious, and she could feel it in every fiber of her being. "Clay, this isn't about us anymore," she said, her voice firm now. "This is about Fiona. I need to know what happened to her. Where is she?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Clay's expression twisted, and for a moment it almost seemed like he was going to answer. But then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the barn door, slamming it shut behind him. Maggie stood there, her mind reeling. She was more certain than ever that Clay was hiding something. But what? What could he possibly know about Fiona's disappearance? As she stood alone in the barn, the pieces began to fall into place. But she wasn't prepared for the next piece of the puzzle that would come crashing into her world. The sound of Hank's truck rumbling up the dirt road snapped Maggie out of her thoughts. She turned to see him pull up beside her, the concern etched deep into his face. He barely had time to put the vehicle in park before he was out of the truck, his eyes scanning her, searching for answers. "Maggie, what's going on?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. She gestured toward the barn, her mouth dry. "I found something, Fiona's headband. In there." The words felt heavy coming out of her mouth, like saying them out loud made them even more real. Hank's face went pale. He didn't question her, didn't tell her she was being ridiculous. He just stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening as he turned his gaze toward the farmhouse. "Where's Clay?" he asked. "Inside," Maggie answered. "But Hank, something's wrong. He was furious when he saw me in the barn. He told me to leave, but it wasn't just anger. It was something else. He's hiding something." Hank nodded once, a silent agreement passing between them. They had spent 10 years waiting for answers, and now, standing here on this farm, it felt like they were standing on the edge of the truth. Without another word, Hank started toward the barn, his footsteps deliberate. Maggie followed close behind, her pulse hammering in her ears. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken, something waiting to be revealed. As they stepped inside, the smell of hay and animals was overwhelming, but Maggie barely noticed it now. Her eyes darted around the space, scanning for anything else that seemed out of place. That's when she heard it, a sound so faint she almost thought she imagined it, a muffled noise, like someone trying to speak but too weak to call out. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Hank must have heard it too, because he turned to her, his expression shifting from determination to something much darker. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Maggie nodded, her whole body tensing. The sound had come from the far side of the barn near the pig enclosures. Her stomach twisted into knots as she took a step forward. The air felt suddenly colder, heavier. "Oh my God," she whispered, barely able to say the words. "Hank, someone's here." Hank didn't wait for another word. He rushed toward the source of the noise, and Maggie followed as fast as she could, her legs feeling like lead. The closer they got, the more the muffled sounds grew louder. Soft whimpers followed by quiet, desperate gasps for breath. Maggie's heart was hammering in her chest, the reality of what was happening hitting her like a freight train. As they reached the pig enclosures, the sounds became clearer, She could hear them now, unmistakable. A voice, weak and scared, calling for help. It was coming from behind one of the pens. Maggie didn't think. She just moved. Without a second thought, she climbed onto the edge of the pen, her hands shaking as she gripped the wooden slats. As she peered inside, her eyes went wide with shock. There, in the corner of the cage, was a small figure, a little girl covered in dirt and grime, one arm chained to a post. Maggie's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. It was Fiona. It had to be. Even though her daughter was thin, covered in muck, and looked nothing like the bright, cheerful child Maggie once knew, there was no mistaking the red hair, the same fiery curls that had once been so full of life. Maggie's knees went weak, and she grabbed the side of the pen to steady herself. "Fiona," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Is that you?" The little girl's eyes were wide with fear, and she barely nodded in response. The sight of her chained, trapped like an animal, tore Maggie's heart into pieces. The girl's face was a mask of confusion and terror. She didn't seem to recognize her mother. Not at first. The pain in Maggie's chest was unbearable, but she knew she couldn't break down now. Not when Fiona needed her the most. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft and soothing. "I'm here. We're going to get you out of here, okay?" Maggie's mind was spinning as she tried to think of what to do next. The truth was finally before her. But the reality was even worse than she had imagined. Clay had kept Fiona locked up all these years, and the horror of it was only beginning to sink in. Maggie reached for her phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. She had to get help. She had to get Fiona out of there, and fast. But as she spoke to the dispatcher, a noise from behind her made her blood run cold. Clay was back, and this time, he wasn't going to let her walk away so easily. Maggie's heart raced as she turned toward the sound of footsteps approaching. Her mind was reeling, and every part of her body screamed to get Fiona to safety, but she couldn't leave her daughter. Not like this. Clay's shadow fell over them as he stepped into the barn, his face twisted in fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. Maggie didn't flinch. She stood tall, her voice trembling but steady. "I know what you've done, Clay," she said. "I know where she is. Fiona is here. You've been hiding her all these years." Clay's expression faltered for just a moment, and for the briefest second, Maggie thought she saw fear flicker in his eyes. But it disappeared just as quickly as it came. He stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists, his anger radiating off him like heat. "You don't know anything," he hissed. "You need to leave. Now." Maggie's heart dropped into her stomach as he took another step closer. "You can't keep her locked up like this," Maggie said, her voice breaking. "You've hurt her, and I'm not leaving until she's safe." She didn't care if she was in danger. Nothing mattered more right now than getting Fiona out of that cage. Hank had moved behind her, his eyes darting between Clay and the pen, clearly assessing the situation. "Maggie, we need to be careful," Hank said quietly, his hand on her shoulder. "Clay's not playing fair. He'll do whatever it takes to keep us from getting Fiona out of here." Maggie nodded, taking a deep breath. She was scared, but there was no turning back now. Just as Clay was about to make a move, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Clay's eyes snapped to the barn door and his face drained of color. He knew he was caught. For a brief moment he stood frozen. Then, without warning, he turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. Maggie's heart raced as she heard the sound of police cars pulling up outside. Help had arrived, but it was almost too late. She quickly turned to the cage and knelt beside Fiona, her hands trembling as she reached for the lock. The sirens grew louder, and soon, the barn was filled with the sound of flashing lights and shouting officers. "Stay with her, Maggie," Hank said, his voice filled with urgency. Maggie nodded, her eyes never leaving Fiona. She could feel her daughter's fear, the confusion in her eyes, but Maggie wouldn't let go. Not this time. She would never stop fighting for Fiona, and as the police rushed in to secure the barn and search for Clay, Maggie felt a sense of hope she hadn't known in years. Fiona was going to be okay. They were going to get through this together.